Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, I have a very important question for you. What if healing narcissism isn't just about dismantling grandiosity? That work is essential. So essential that I just wrapped up a 4-part series on how to diminish the severity and brutality of the pathological grandiose self. But there's another key to change that often gets overlooked. What if part of the work is helping someone feel something they've spent a lifetime avoiding? In this episode, we're going to think about the difference between shame and guilt. At first glance, they might seem similar. Both come with pain. Both relate to our failures. But psychodynamically, they're worlds apart. On the most surface level, shame is often portrayed as low self-esteem and guilt as a moral compass. Or, more frequently noted, shame says, I am bad. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Now, while I had originally planned to cover both in depth, I realized that shame requires its own space. So today, we're going to focus primarily on shame, what it is, how it operates psychodynamically, and what the healing process actually looks like. Only once shame has been worked through can true guilt emerge. I'll touch on this here, but we'll take a deeper dive into guilt in the next episode, so stay tuned for that. Here's the thing. Many narcissistic patients can't access guilt. Well, not really. Not in a way that leads to ownership, mourning, or repair. What they often carry instead is a buried core of shame, oftentimes unspoken and intolerable. That shame gets hidden under defenses like perfectionism, rage, control, projection, devaluation. In short, what I've called in prior episodes and what's known as the pathological grandiose structure. See, that covers all of these things up, so you don't always see the shame. But something powerful happens in psychodynamic treatment when a person moves from shame into guilt. Guilt opens the door to something shame never can: accountability without collapse. And that's essential for real change to occur. Does this sound familiar? Perhaps you or someone you know proclaims their love for their mother or abusive husband, despite years of emotional torture, right? Maybe the volatile spouse isn't seen as abusive, but they see them simply as, and they make excuses. They say things like, oh, they're just hurt, or they're having a bad day. They make these excuses when they become abusive. These are moments where unconscious guilt may be in play. Not guilt for being abused, but a deeper, often irrational sense of responsibility, or back to the word I just used a moment ago, accountability, for someone's abusive behavior. But before we can fully make sense of this misguided accountability, this kind of guilt, we need to understand the role of shame. If we try to rush past shame, if we don't give it space to be seen, named, and worked through, then guilt can't truly come online in a meaningful, transformative way. So, what is shame? And how does it present in the consulting room, in your inner world, and in our relational patterns? Shame isn't just a feeling, it's a state of being. It colors the entire self, leading someone to feel defective, unworthy, or, and I quote, exposed at their core. I quote that because that's a big part of shame that I want to dwell on. In psychodynamic terms, shame is often rooted in early relational failures where the child's authentic needs were met with misattunement, punishment, or humiliation. Unlike guilt, which allows for the preservation of a good internal object alongside of regret. And don't worry, I'll break that down and I'll make sense of that, what I mean by the preservation of a good internal object when we go deeper into guilt. But for now, I want to say shame attacks the self globally. So in other words, you lose that good internal representation. And for someone with narcissistic defenses, that can be too much to bear. So the psyche builds elaborate structures to keep shame out of awareness. Let's take a closer look at how that process unfolds and what it takes relationally and therapeutically to help someone move from a place of unbearable shame toward the possibility of repair. But wait, what is being repaired? You may now be asking. What does that even mean? Shame is an interpersonal experience. It arises when we feel caught in a position of inadequacy or inferiority. When something private inside of us, so you see, it's both intrapsychic, it's internal, but it's interpersonal as well. That's what makes shame very complicated. So it's when something private, internal, in us suddenly becomes exposed. And again, that word exposed is critical when thinking of shame. And judged as terrible, or at least we imagine it's being judged. But that's another thing I'll talk about momentarily. So just to reiterate, shame is not just internal, but it's also relational. It's about the gaze of the other. It's about the way we imagine, and this could be either real or imagined, right? The way we imagine or perceive that someone is looking at us. As John Steiner, a renowned psychoanalyst, describes, narcissistic organizations can create, and I quote, psychic retreats. And you may have heard me mention this concept before. They exist precisely to avoid this kind of gaze, this kind of judging gaze. So the psychic retreat is to escape being seen, because being seen is humiliating. Being seen brings back with it a threat. That's the exposure of a need, right? And we know internally that this need of being disregarded or belittled or shamed or criticized is coming from somewhere. And again, that's the overlap between the intrapsychic and interpersonal. Let's hover for a moment over that thought. The exposure of needs that were once disregarded, belittled, or shamed. When were these needs disregarded, belittled, or shamed? And again, what does that even mean? Shame often originates in early moments when a child expresses an emotional need and looks to a caregiver for a response. The caregiver's gaze, consciously or unconsciously, can reflect joy, attunement, comfort, or disapproval, rejection, or even contempt. Think about the little boy who comes home crying to his father after having fallen down and scraped his knee, and his father tells him to get over it and stop acting like a baby. This mismatch becomes internalized, in other words, taken inside of oneself. And for the purpose of this discussion, because it's a little bit more complicated, it becomes later reactivated as shame. What begins as a bid for comforting and connection can become fused with self-consciousness, embarrassment, and ultimately deep shame. In part, this is what the narcissistic grandiose self defends against. Grandiose attitudes and apparent invincibility serve to protect the psyche from the unbearable feelings underneath: vulnerability, neediness, self-doubt. In other words, how will dad respond? And mistrust and distress. I could keep going, but I think you get the point. But when the structure begins to dissolve, That's the grandiose structure. When it begins to dissolve in treatment, as again I covered in our 4-part series on healing narcissism, what emerges is the terrifying sense of being seen. So it's like coming out of a cult. One doesn't just come out and feel liberated, right? There's this terrifying sense because you were hidden away for so long. No longer hidden behind omnipotence, the self now becomes exposed, raw, and profoundly vulnerable to humiliation. In this state, many individuals can't tolerate the emotions associated with shame, so they find ways to avoid it. Some try to hide again. Others attempt to reverse the experience by eliciting admiration, performing for approval, and some go further still, defending against their own shame by inflicting it on others, projecting humiliation as a form of psychic protection. And this is, I quote this, "What is the matter with you?" Or even more severe, and I quote, "You're such an idiot." Imagine a relationship where one partner, let's just say the woman, witnesses her husband glancing at another woman during dinner. This moment, seemingly small, disrupts the illusion of fusion between them. She no longer feels like the only one being seen. In that flash, she's exposed to feelings of exclusion, smallness, and inferiority. To defend against those feelings, which, by the way, again, I'm just reminding you, may not be conscious, right? That's the whole point of defending against those feelings. She might lash out, accusing him, attacking him, not only to protect against her shame, but to reclaim a narcissistic position of superiority. In this way, shame gets externalized. That's the projection that I just mentioned a moment ago. She now feels triumphant. Or she, let's say, just to say this another way, she parks the shame inside of her partner and she feels superior. This is what we're dealing with when we talk about narcissistic shame. It's not simply feeling bad about oneself. It's the collapse of the self in the face of being seen too closely, too truthfully. And for healing to happen, for guilt and repair to emerge, we cannot meet shame with cheerleading, reassurance, or premature forgiveness. Yes, that's often what I see and I hear in my work with these individuals who come in after having a prior unsuccessful treatment experience. They were told, and I'm quoting, "You're not pathetic." This is when they're complaining and they're in a shameful state. This is when the defenses break down, which they do quite frequently in the narcissistically vulnerable individual. And they're told, "You're not pathetic. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You're strong. You'll get through this." Or, "No shame in your game." These kinds of responses, while they're well-intentioned, can feel like a refusal to sit with the person in the actual experience of shame. The pep talk, the push to forgive oneself, the attempts to move past it, all of it bypasses the very feeling that needs to be metabolized. All of what we are discussing today, what it means, and how it feels to be, and again I quote, seen and exposed. All of what it means to come out of the grandiose structure and have a need or a vulnerability around an inadequacy. To better understand what all of these responses miss, let's turn now to what shame actually looks like in the room and how it plays out moment to moment in relationships. Here are some common prototypical examples.
Let's take a quick break.
I get a lot of messages from listeners saying, "Dr. Mazzella, I wish I could talk to you directly, but I also know that private therapy or one-on-one sessions aren't always possible or affordable. That's why I'm thinking about creating office hours, a low-cost, small group space where you can bring your questions about the podcast content, your confusion about narcissistic relationships, traits, and dynamics, and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's room for real conversation too. This space is designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If this speaks to you, head to drmazzella.com/office hours or just click on the link in the show notes to get notified when it launches. Okay, hope to see you there. Your partner makes a decision, maybe about something small like weekend plans or something bigger, without consulting with you first. And suddenly you feel dismissed, unimportant, maybe even invisible. Or maybe you're in a conversation and someone corrects you, just a small thing, a minor detail, but instead of brushing it off, you find yourself flooded with self-doubt, maybe even a surge of anger. These are just a few examples of shame, sometimes, but not always, conscious. Let's take someone who spirals into emotional pain when her partner doesn't respond to a text right away. She sees the delay as proof that she doesn't matter, that he doesn't care. But the intensity of her reaction seems out of proportion. That's because the pain isn't just about the delayed response. On a deeper level, this isn't about the delayed text response. It's about what the delay emotionally represents. To deepen the work, I might gently ask, when you feel that delay and you express that you don't matter, what image comes to mind? Or what thoughts come to mind about not mattering? And depending on her response and readiness to look at this more closely, I might follow up with, have you ever felt something like this before? Or does this remind you of anyone who made you feel that kind of panic or invisibility? Now, just as an aside, I'm not so crazy about that question, and you may have heard me say this before, and you may have noticed it yourself. But that question, does this remind you of, takes the person out of the moment. And being in the moment, in my opinion, is usually much more valuable. It's much more affectively alive. And that's why I'm more inclined to use those earlier questions that I just mentioned. What happens is when things go accordingly, we slowly come to discover that she experiences her partner like her emotionally unavailable parent. So the partner becomes the parent, someone physically present but psychologically absent. So when he doesn't reply immediately, it doesn't just hurt. It reactivates a long-standing belief that she's unlovable, unworthy of care, and destined to be ignored. Again, not always conscious. But this is what we call a shame response. As she begins to explore her internal world, the pain starts to make sense, not as irrational. In other words, her being in pain is not irrational, because you could say, oh, it was only a 90-minute or a 1-hour delay. You're behaving irrationally. No, the pain is not irrational, but it has one foot in the present and one foot in the past. In other words, as we get closer to her experience and I open it up with those questions I mentioned earlier, what we understand is that it's rooted in earlier experiences and in the present, but also in the past. That's what I'm emphasizing. She might describe, and this is typically what I hear, by the way, is a mother who was chronically distracted, emotionally unavailable, or simply not there, like the times her mother came late to pick her up after school, and she was left waiting. All the other kids went home, and sitting in a state of doubt, not knowing, not trusting that her mother would arrive or when she would arrive. Or another patient might recall a father who called him, and I quote, stupid and a loser, or a father who constantly threatened to leave if he didn't behave, and then even more severe, a father who would become physically abusive. So back to her. She says, I'm not important. And again, in her words, she says, my entire self-worth is made or broken by another person's response to me. She says these things as we come to recognize all of what's going on inside of her, and we begin to put this together, what we're seeing here is the past flooding the present. It's not just about a late text or a minor correction. It's about the emotional experience of being forgotten, left waiting, or devalued. It taps into a deeper shame, and I quote, "I wasn't important enough to remember," unquote. Without realizing it, the boyfriend becomes a stand-in for the earlier caregiver. An hour-long delay isn't just a frustration. It becomes a psychic reenactment of being left behind, emotionally and literally. And I might reflect on this gently. I may say something like, part of you knows that this is just an hour, but another part feels something much deeper in that silence as you're waiting for the response. But what happens when there's no one there to help her understand where her reaction and her feelings are coming from? That's where we see the next critical turn, when shame flips into something else: control, rage, or withdrawal, as a way to manage the unbearable feelings. Okay, so in this prototypical example, when he does eventually respond, she doesn't feel any sense of relief. The shame has already calcified into something sharper: anger. She might withdraw. She might not respond to the text message when he responds. She may grow cold and pull away from him, or she may lash out. Instead of welcoming him back with warmth, she punishes the delay, making him wait, interrogating his reasons for the delay, or acting emotionally distant. This is an important moment to help her begin to mentalize the shift, to see how the vulnerable wish for love quickly transforms into a protective stance. It is as if she's saying, "You don't get to hurt me, embarrass, or diminish me. I will show you." Or, "You hurt me, now I will hurt you." From a psychodynamic perspective, this retaliatory position often masks a more fragile internal experience. The goal is to help someone like this begin to think, what's it like to need someone who keeps you waiting or who lets you down? What's it like to need someone? That's the exposure, by the way. That's the vulnerability. This question, as you can imagine, gets at the heart of shame, or I should say a shame-filled longing to be seen, to matter, and to be responded to with care. You can see in this composite example how the deepening memories are crucial, because now we're moving from a simple narrative of deprivation. He corrected me in front of guests, or he didn't return my text quickly enough, to one that's emotionally layered, ambivalent, conflicted, and more psychologically alive. In her childhood memories, this isn't just a story about an absent mother. It's also the story of a defended child, one who learned and developed an unconscious strategy, which is what? In her words, "I don't need your help. I'm mad at you, so I push you away." Underneath that fierce independence, underneath the refusal to need or rely on anyone, which, by the way, are traits that are always present in narcissistically vulnerable individuals, there's often a profound sense of unworthiness. The belief isn't just, "I can't count on you to show up on time." It's also, and this part oftentimes, again, is not conscious until we do this deeper work, but it's also, "I must not be worth showing up for." And as you can imagine, again, that's far more painful to consider. It's much safer and easier and comfortable to attack or to withdraw. This is shame in its most corrosive form, not just a fleeting emotion, but an internal conviction that needing love, or asking for help, or relying on someone, or waiting for someone to return your text message exposes something defective or even pathetic about your sense of self. Remember what I said a moment ago. I must not be worth showing up for. Okay, so where are we? We started with a simple scenario. Someone doesn't text back, and follow that thread into something much deeper. The transformation of shame into anger, coldness, and control. We saw how early relational wounds, especially when met with consistent failure or absence or lack of empathy, lead to unconscious strategies of defense, strategies that carry forward into adult relationships. But we're not done. This is where we begin to shift the focus to guilt, not just the guilt of the perpetrator, but the complex, often buried guilt within the traumatized sense of self, the traumatized individual. Why guilt, you may now be asking? Because once shame has been named and held, once the defensive posture begins to soften, what often surfaces next is guilt. Not the guilt of wrongdoing in the traditional sense, but a deeper, more conflicted guilt. The guilt of needing, of feeling angry at those who we depend on, and of having wished, or in this example, even acted on the wish for retaliation or withdrawal from those who have hurt you. It's the guilt that comes when we realize our anger, our rage may have hurt or pushed others away. In our next episode, we'll look more closely at guilt, how it differs from shame, why it's so hard to access in narcissistic structures, and how understanding it might hold the key to genuine repair. So please, if you're interested in learning more about these narcissistic dynamics, be sure to follow this show. Okay, everybody, until next time, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.